So again, welcome to our program tonight. We are very excited to have author and scientist and however else he will describe himself, historian, Eric J. Dolin with us here tonight. It is a program that is part of the sustainability series that we do in partnership with Together Yes and Progress Norwood in town here. And it's also a program that's being supported by a federal grant, an LSTA grant called Norwood Civic Hub. This grant is being administered by the Mass Board of Library Commissioners on behalf of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Norwood Civic Hub is part of a year-long series of programs based around education and providing public forums for folks to have discussions about topics that are facing folks here in town. So who is our author tonight? Tonight we are joined by Eric J. Dolin. He grew up in the Northeast and has had a lifelong interest in the natural world and the ocean specifically. At Brown University, he found a passion for environmental policy and went on to get a master's degree in environmental management from Yale and his PhD in environmental policy and planning from MIT, where his dissertation, focused on the role of the courts in the cleanup of our very own Boston Harbor. His career has ranged from the National Marine Fisheries Service to the EPA to Business Week, Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, and the National Wildlife Federation. He's the author of 14 books and more than 60 articles in newspapers, magazines, and professional publications. And his most recent books include, among others, Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, Black Flags, Blue Waters, The Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates, which in 2019 was a finalist for the Nonfiction Award from the Boston Authors Club. And of course, his most recent publication, A Furious Sky, The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes, which has shown up on a number of heavy hitter best of lists on the national stage, including lists about the best science books of 2020 and the best nonfiction books of 2020. So we're very excited to have Eric with us here tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks everybody for showing up. I wish that I could be in person, but unfortunately not this time, hopefully another time in the future. And I want to thank the Morrill Library for inviting me as well, and everybody else who contributed to the ability to have me here. So let me make sure that my clicker is working. Let's see, there we go. In writing this book, I came across a lot of really fascinating stories, including one that involved the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. In mid-August of that year, a vessel called the Watch and Wait was getting ready to sail from Ipswich, Massachusetts to Marblehead, Massachusetts, where I live at the moment. And on board that ship, there were 23 people, including Anthony Thacker and his wife and 4 of his children. But as they sailed by Cape Ann, the hurricane blew in and actually crashed the ship on the shore of an uninhabited island. Everybody on board the vessel died except for Anthony and his wife. Almost naked, they managed to crawl out of the destroyed ship and swim to the uninhabited island, where they survived for 5 days before a vessel came by and picked them up. The Massachusetts legislature felt so horrible about the tragedy that Anthony Thacker had to endure that they gave him the island upon which he had foundered, which you know today as Thacker Island or Thatcher Island, which is part of Rockport, Massachusetts. Then there's this story from the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926. A little to the north of Miami is Fort Lauderdale. A husband and wife were in their house when this massive hurricane came roaring in. The house collapsed, pinning the husband under a slab of concrete. As the water rose, the wife tried valiantly to free her husband from the rubble, but she was unsuccessful. She refused to leave, even as the water crept higher and higher. He kept begging her to leave, but she kept refusing. Finally, when the water was nearing his chin and partially submerging her, She finally relented, gave him a kiss goodbye, and then fled to safety. Then there's this story from the Great Hurricane of 1938, which a lot of people around here are quite familiar with, which hit Norwood with some force on September 21st. On that morning, there was a man at the tip of Long Island who had been waiting with bated breath for the arrival of a new barometer, a fancy new barometer. When he got the package that morning, he opened it, took out his barometer, and quickly got very upset because the barometer's needle was pointing to a reading that was so low that it could only mean one of two things. Either a hurricane was already there or one was fast approaching. Yet, when he looked outside to the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, they were calm and the sun was shining down from above. So he sat down and he wrote an angry letter to the manufacturer of the barometer and drove into town to mail it at the local post office. He shouldn't have been so rash, because by the time that he returned, his house and his precious barometer had been washed away by the hurricane. Now, Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but the book is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There is the intriguing history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war and the fortunes of individuals adds to the story. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology play an important part, as does the role of the women's movement and its the role that it played in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront thorny questions about how we can learn to survive and adapt from the continued barrage of the greatest storms on Earth. Hurricanes are an inevitable and painful part of the American experience. Just as we can count on the sun rising and setting each day, so too can we expect hurricanes to periodically visit our shores. If you're among the many tens of millions of people inhabiting the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, or Hawaii, hurricanes are looming threats that might invade your life. The hurricane season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes, which are defined as having sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Typically, 2 hurricanes make landfall in the United States annually, and a major one pummels us once every 2 years. Now, hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been hit by hurricanes, residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for roughly 40% of all hurricane strikes. Here in New England, we can expect to get a hurricane landfall about once every 10 years. Hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all natural disasters in the United States that have exceeded $1 billion in damage. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed nearly 30,000 people. A Furious Sky is the history of the hurricanes that have hit what is today the United States. But before going any further, I need to define a term. What is a hurricane? Simply put, hurricanes are violent swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, thereby providing the massive amounts of heat energy necessary to drive the storm. 2 other conditions that are necessary for a hurricane to thrive are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air that evaporates from the ocean surface. When that moist air rises, it cools and condenses, forming clouds and releasing the latent heat of condensation, which powers the storm. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to more than 1,000 and over 50,000 feet high. They rotate in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern. They're characterized by extremely low pressure and a relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. Many people have tried to describe hurricanes over the centuries, including a teenage Alexander Hamilton, who wrote about a hurricane that barreled into his home island of St. Croix in August of 1772. He wrote in part, "Good God, what horror and destruction! It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into the angels." This letter, which he wrote to his father, was actually published in a local newspaper, and the wealthy merchants on St. Croix saw such promise in this young man that they banded together and raised enough money to send him to college in New York City. And the rest, as we say, is history. Hurricanes have had a significant impact on the course of colonial history. For example, two strong hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean in 1780 killed nearly 22,000 people and destroyed numerous French and British warships that were there using the area as a staging area. Those hurricanes caused the French fleet to decide that staying in the Caribbean during hurricane season was too dangerous. So when the next hurricane season rolled around in 1781, the French sailed north, both to escape hurricane season, but also to help their erstwhile allies, the Americans, in their fight against the British. By following this course of action, the French played a key role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake and the ultimate American victory over British forces in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19th, 1781. Of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the founding of the United States, and many hundreds of them have pummeled us over the last 237 years, including the Great September Gale of 1815, which was just a hurricane by another name, which roared over Long Island and right into New England, hitting especially hard in Providence. This is a contemporary painting of what Providence, or downtown Providence, supposedly looked like during the height of the hurricane. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 leveled the city and killed at least 6,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps located in the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were there building a highway to Key West. It is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane to hit the United States mainland, with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts that were well over 200 miles per hour. At one of the work camps, a doctor came upon a veteran named Elmer Pressburg, who was impaled by a 2x4 that went clear through his chest, right below his ribs. He was alive and amazingly calm given the circumstances. The doctor told him that he wanted to pull out the piece of wood and offered him a shot of morphine to dull the pain. Pressburg refused, telling the doctor it didn't matter, since he was going to die as soon as the wood was removed. What he really wanted was a last drink, and he asked for 2 beers, which were quickly provided. After finishing them, Pressburg said, "Now pull." The doctor did, and Pressburg died. The Great Hurricane of 1938 delivered a body blow to New England, resulting in damages of $300 to $400 million and killing 680 people, making it the worst natural disaster ever to visit New England. The actress Katharine Hepburn, who had already won an Oscar at this time, was at her family's Victorian summer home at the edge of the water in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane struck. She and 5 other people escaped the house as it was being ripped apart and torn from its foundation, and they sought refuge in a nearby inn on higher ground. Looking back, Hepburn would later recall, "We saw the house slowly turn around and sail off to the northeast and start down the brook which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away as easy as pie." Later, she called her father in Hartford. When she told him that the house was gone, he responded, "I suppose you didn't have brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire. Hurricane Carol, which struck the eastern tip of Long Island, then plowed into New England in 1954, August of 1954, left 60 people dead and caused nearly $500 million in damage. The most iconic casualty of Hurricane Carol was the steeple on the Old North Church in Boston, which tumbled to the ground. Hurricane Camille in August of 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi. Of the many people who suffered during Camille, none had a greater burden to bear than Paul Williams, the caretaker of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul, his wife Myrtle, and most of their children decided to hide or repair to the auditorium which was attached to the church to ride out the storm. The hurricane demolished the auditorium, and in the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with one grandchild and his beloved wife, Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile-wide swath of misery through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were destroyed, making more than 160,000 people homeless overnight. Total damage approached $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the zoo's aviary was smashed. To shelter the Caribbean flamingos from the storm, the staff at the zoo herded the flock into one of the men's bathrooms, which is the image shown here. Hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note, the most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11th, 1992. It killed 6 people and cost $3.1 billion. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for the film Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie crammed into the ballroom at the Westin Kauai Hotel to take shelter from the storm. At the height of the hurricane, Spielberg and a couple of cameramen went down to the shore to take some film of the massive waves crashing into the beach. That film footage actually made its way into the film. The crew survived, and a few weeks later, Spielberg filmed one last scene on Oahu, since the film sets on Kauai had been trashed. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever to make landfall in the United States. It left about 1,800 people dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around New Orleans left 80% of the city submerged in water that was up to 10 feet deep. It took the better part of a week for a wide range of organizations and individuals to rescue or respond to the many thousands trapped in homes, businesses, and hospitals. It wasn't until Monday, September 5th, that the Army Corps finally closed all the levee breaches, and by October, the city was finally drained. 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29th, 2012, killing more than 150 people and resulting in $65 billion in damage. It was called at the time the Frankenstorm, or the Halloween horror, since it struck right around the time of Halloween. Sandy's waves pounded the shore with such force that their vibrations were picked up by seismographs 2,500 miles away in Seattle. New York was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines and automobile tunnels were flooded. At one point, close to 1 million Con Edison electricity customers lost power. And the hits just kept on coming. The 2017 hurricane season turned out to be one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore. But what really made 2017 a special year for hurricanes was that 3 out of the 4 hurricanes that came ashore were major ones. Each of those were Category 4s with winds of at least 130 miles per hour. Never before had there been 3 Category 3s that made landfall in a single year. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, making 2017 the most expensive hurricane season on record by far. Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain in Houston within 48 hours. In Nederland, Texas, more than 60 inches of rain fell, setting an all-time record for a single storm. Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, setting a record for sustained wind intensity. Irma's winds destroyed 50% of Florida's orange crop. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4 with winds of 155 miles per hour, and it dumped up to 3 feet of water in some areas. Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every human-made structure outside the capital of San Juan and many within the city's limits, and knocked out power to the entire island, leaving its 3.4 million residents in the dark. The death toll from Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with estimates ranging from 1,400 all the way up to 4,700. While A Furious Sky details some of the most destructive hurricanes to reach our shores, it also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, and communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743 that moved from Philadelphia to Boston, Benjamin Franklin became the first person to realize that hurricanes had forward movement and that a hurricane's winds could blow contrary to the wind in which it was moved, to the direction in which it was moving. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, arguments between amateur and professional meteorologists helped to develop the basic image of a hurricane as a mass of swirling, moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one approaches the center of the storm until one enters the calm, clear, and surprisingly beautiful eye. The advent of the telegraph, then the radio, followed by hurricane hunter planes, which fly into the heart of a hurricane, and the Earth-orbiting satellites all contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. Such advances, combined with vast improvements in computer-based weather prediction models, means that we have advance warnings of a hurricane's strength and the timing of its arrival. There have also been dramatic changes in the way we identify hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor of the modern National Weather Service, decided to begin naming hurricanes after women. This decision angered many who thought it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One woman said she would rather have an unnamed hurricane hit her house than one named after one of her husband's former girlfriends. The Bureau, however, would not be swayed. It stuck fast to its naming system, making it permanent in 1956. Protests died down, that is, until Roxy Bolton, shown here with Eleanor Roosevelt, spoke up. Bolton was a vice president for the National Organization for Women, or NOW, based in Florida. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, vicious, and treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being arbitrarily associated with disaster. Bolton offered some alternatives. Hurricanes could, she said, be named after birds or perhaps senators who loved having things named after them. She even recommended that hurricanes be called himicanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then, during Jimmy Carter's presidency, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Director, U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Dr. Juanita Krebs, the first woman to ever hold that post, took up the cause. A self-described feminist, Krebs supported Bolton's initiative, and in 1979, gender equality won out over tired bureaucracy. From that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes would alternate between male and female names. Now, meteorologists have not only been interested in forecasting and naming hurricanes, but for a time at least, they were interested in controlling them. From the late 1940s through the early 1980s, there were various government experiments to seed hurricanes to see if they could weaken them, to drop like silver nitrate and other substances into the clouds of hurricanes. None of them succeeded. Since the mid to late 1900s, many other methods besides cloud seeding have been suggested for controlling and even eliminating hurricanes. Some of the most fanciful ideas included flying an enormous fleet of propeller-driven planes around a hurricane in a counterclockwise direction to unwind the storm, or towing icebergs from the Arctic down to tropical waters to cool off the ocean and sap the hurricanes of their energy. Then there's one of the most popular suggestions of all: nuke the hurricanes, drop a nuclear bomb into the center of a hurricane. All I can tell you is that would put barely a dent into the hurricane's force and power, but it would create some rather nasty radioactive fallout. The cycle continues. Every year, a new hurricane season unfolds. No matter what an individual hurricane season brings, one thing is certain: the United States will continue to be pummeled by these tremendous storms. And because of global warming, hurricanes of the future will most likely be worse than those of the past. This, I think, is a picture of Scituate, actually. Now, global warming has already made the impact of hurricanes worse because sea level has risen as a result of the thermal expansion of the oceans and the melting of glaciers. Storm surges associated with hurricanes are higher and more destructive. For example, 100 years ago, the average height of the water off of New York City was an entire foot lower than it is today. So if the same hurricane hit 100 years ago versus today, it would cause considerably less damage. But today there's a lot more to damage. A growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation during hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain higher concentrations of moisture, which can come down as rain. Considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy to fuel hurricanes, will make the winds produced by these storms even more powerful. Thus, under the warmer conditions that predictions say will be the norm toward the end of this century, it is likely that hurricanes will be stronger and wetter. And even more troubling is some new research that is showing that in a warmer world, hurricanes will probably linger longer, or they will move more slowly. So you saw what happened during Hurricane Harvey, when the hurricane basically parked itself over Texas for the better part of 2 days. That just subjects any area in the line of fire to much more punishing winds and much more rain. So that is a serious concern. At this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty exactly how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists would be the first to admit that there are still many unknowns, as well as limitations in the data and modeling, that make it exceedingly difficult to predict the impact of a warmer world on these massive storms. The mounting scientific consensus that an increase in global warming will likely make future hurricanes worse, however, is not encouraging. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society still has to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, the potential impact of hurricanes will only increase. As this book was heading into the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian riveted the nation. Beginning in late 2019, Americans watched the round-the-clock coverage of this rapidly intensifying storm as it swept over the Atlantic. Each day, reports became more alarming as Dorian not only grew into a monster Category 5 hurricane, but also appeared to be heading directly for the east coast of the United States. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place for an excruciating 40 hours before moving on as a Category 2 hurricane. Some models said it would still strike the United States, prompting mandatory evacuations from Florida to Virginia. Over the next few days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status before making its only landfall in the United States, a glancing blow on Cape Hatteras. After that, the hurricane zoomed off to the northeast, finally hitting Nova Scotia, where it knocked out power for 400,000 people. While Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what happened to the Bahamas and what might have happened if the hurricane had plowed head-on into the coast, instead of skirting the mainland and clipping North Carolina before sailing off into the Atlantic. This time, America was lucky, but if the history of hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. And this is my last slide. This is me when I was a lot younger, in 1991, after Hurricane Bob had hit Massachusetts. My wife at the time worked for the state of Massachusetts on a tree planting program. And she was sent down there to look at the damage that the hurricane had done to local trees. So I tagged along. And this is a picture of me on a beach in Falmouth in front of what used to be a summer cottage that was destroyed by the hurricane. And with that, I am done. So I will stop the share, and I'm happy to answer any questions. That should have stopped. I don't know if I'm back. Hello? I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
And for the viewers at home, I do recommend that you switch your view to speaker view. If it's not already, you'll get to see more of Eric and less of small little black squares on your screen. Thank you very, very much for that program. That is,
sure.
Well, you know, part of the reason why Together Yes and Progress Nor were so receptive to my suggestion of having you is that you pull together a lot of research, a lot of science-based studies and history, but you also combine it well with the intersection of humanity. You know, what is the impact not only of humans on this issue, but of hurricanes on people?
Right.
And I wonder what do you think draws people to hurricanes as a topic of interest? Because as you pointed out, it's a very tragic situation many times. So why do you think that we're interested?
It's probably sort of the same reason that people read murder mysteries, which is about a horrible event and why people rubberneck on a highway when there's an accident. There's something fascinating and gripping about large-scale tragedies, which unfortunately hurricanes are most often, but also it's a made-for-TV experience, especially with 24-hour news coverage and the Weather Channel and people sending their reporters out into the eye of the hurricane to take shots and interview people. It's compelling human drama. And I'm not saying that people like it because they're thinking, well, there for the grace of God go I, those people are suffering, I'm not, I feel good. That's not what I think it is. I just think it's such a massive event with such major ramifications, so many stories of personal tragedy and triumph in some cases, and human kindness. And then you wrap it in with science and weather and everything else, and it's just a compelling human drama. I myself, before I wrote this book, I didn't know a lot about hurricanes, but whenever there was a major hurricane, and I remember Hurricane Katrina, I was glued to the TV for days on end, just trying to figure out what had happened. And then I became even more fascinated because at the time, I was very involved in political science, I became fascinated by the federal government and the state and local governments' rather poor response to Katrina and what that meant for public policy. So I don't think we're ever not going to be fascinated by these hurricanes or tornadoes or other massive natural events. It's just human nature. And since I'm speaking to people mainly in Massachusetts, I'm not trying to scare you, but we do get a hurricane landfall about once every 10 years. We are due for another hurricane landfall in New England. A lot of people think that Hurricane Sandy was a New England hurricane because we got some of the impact. Well, Hurricane Sandy was almost 1,000 miles wide. It actually made landfall in New York and New Jersey. If a hurricane like Sandy had traveled further north and come ashore in Boston, it'd be quite a different story. And now with warmer waters, not only are lobsters and all sorts of fish that we like to eat moving further to the north or farther to the north, and moving into Canada in some instances, but also water off of the New England coast is getting noticeably warmer, especially in the Massachusetts Bay. So if we ever have another hurricane that tracks northward, the one thing that it needs more than anything else to maintain strength is warm water to feed off of. So if the waters off of New England are warmer and a hurricane comes heading this way, it just means that that hurricane will have more juice. So I would not be surprised if in my lifetime, hopefully I have a long lifetime, in my lifetime, we have another Category 2 or Category 3, or maybe, I hope not, a Category 4 hurricane strike New England.
So we do have a few questions rolling in, and there's actually one that's a really good tag off of that one, which is the other reason they were so receptive to my suggestion of hosting you, is that as residents of Norwood know, unfortunately, we were gifted with a 100-year storm, a massive storm back in the summer of 2020. We had a ridiculous record-breaking amount of rainfall in just a few short hours. And I think we're all pretty amazed at the amount of damage that well, not a hurricane, just an extremely strong thunder cell wrought on Norwood. So we have a question about, are there any plans possible for hurricane survival? For instance, the local groups are working on stormwater management to help prevent future floods in our town. Are there any tips that you can offer off the top of your head for people on what to do if a hurricane does head towards Massachusetts?
Well, the first thing is listen to government officials, regardless of what you think about the government. They have your best interest in heart, especially weather forecasters. And if you're told to evacuate, evacuate. I don't think it'll come to evacuations unless you're right along the coast. So that's one thing. Other things you can do is think about what's your plan in the event of a hurricane. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do? Do you have a go bag? Some people like to have a bag filled with things that they might need if they have to leave their house quickly. Now, I'm not sure that's necessary because with the nature of our satellites, we know about a hurricane heading in our direction days in advance. It may not, and they can make major shifts in the last couple of hours, so it's not always a guarantee. But if you hear that a hurricane is heading up the coast and it's off of North Carolina, and predictions are that it might strike New England, you might want to start thinking a few days before it gets closer what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, protect your house, take outdoor furniture inside, tie things down, and then, pay attention to what the weather forecasters say and act appropriately. From a larger societal perspective, we need to spend a lot more time not only thinking about how to survive a hurricane, but more importantly, how to deal with global climate change, which is very real. And whether you believe it or not, if you don't believe it, I'm telling you, the ocean level has risen. Nobody disagrees with that. And it's because the world has gotten warmer. You can argue about why the world has gotten warmer. But coastal areas, which Norwood is not one, but coastal areas in Massachusetts have to be particularly on guard. And a lot of coastal property, even when we have just a powerful nor'easter, gets damaged. So one other thing to be concerned about is look around your house. It's been a long time since I've been in Norwood, but I think there are a lot of nice trees there, a lot of big trees. If your house has some rather large trees that don't look particularly healthy, that are very close by the house, you might want to think about trimming them or maybe even cutting them down. But that's not just for a hurricane, that's for a major storm. Just in my town, in my street, in Marblehead, we had a storm a couple of months ago, and a few very big trees on this street and the next one over, major limbs, like 30-foot limbs, broke off and fell onto the street. Luckily, no car was there. But you need to pay attention to your arboreal environment and whether you have trees nearby that aren't as strong as perhaps they should be.
Thank you. And somebody did point out that the Baptist Church for the 1938 hurricane lost its steeple, just like North Church did.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the North Church, just a little point of interest, the North Church lost its steeple in the early 1800s, the old North Church, probably from another hurricane, not exactly clear, but a major storm. So then it lost it again during Hurricane Carol. But the people who own the old North Church or run the church, diocese, not diocese, but anyway, the people who run the church, they decided, okay, we're not going to let Mother Nature mess with us anymore. So the new steeple that is on the old North Church now has steel girders underneath the wood on the outside. So I don't think any hurricane is going to knock it off the roof anymore.
Okay, this is a good tip. I hope somebody's taking notes because the Town Hall Memorial Hall right now is getting a rehab for the Carillon bells. So maybe we're taking notes on that. So you do have some comments, some compliments coming in. People are very, very excited and pleased with the book. We've
Thank
had
you.
folks who have read it, and that's wonderful.
Thanks.
Very informative. Somebody actually had a question that I was wondering, have you ever tagged along with one of the Hurricane Hunter crews? And if you have, what's it like?
I have not. This I don't know if this is a sore point, but a lot of people ask me, because I write books on lots of different topics and they always ask me, well, what kind of experience have you had with it? And my simple answer, or my sort of silly answer is, well, I wrote a book on whaling and I've never hunted a whale. I wrote a book on the fur trade and I've never trapped a beaver and I don't own a fur coat. I wrote a book on the China trade, which actually is translated into Chinese, and I've never been to China. I wrote a book on lighthouses, and I had only visited one lighthouse before I wrote the book, but since then I've visited other ones. So with respect to this book, I thought about contacting the Hurricane Hunter people and maybe going on a flight, but as I assure you, the people will understand, writing, while it's a great career and I love it, it's not the most lucrative profession in the world. And I don't get grants to go do my travel while I'm researching. So if I wanted to go down to Florida on a Hurricane Hunter plane, I would have to foot the bill. And I wasn't that interested in doing it. And I'm not sure I was brave enough to go. I'd go if they invited me. And I've actually been interviewed by a lot of meteorologists, both on TV and on podcasts. And maybe someday I'll get invited to go on a Hurricane Hunter flight. And I would go. But no, I didn't go on it. The only experience I have with a hurricane are the remnants of hurricanes. And I remember specifically Hurricane Bob. I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And at the height of the hurricane, which really didn't affect Boston too much, but there were whipping winds, I decided that I'd go for a run along the Charles River. And here's my exciting story. I was running along the Charles River, and all of a sudden I got hit in the forehead with a large oak leaf. And it sounds silly, but it was traveling so fast that it left a red mark on my forehead. And I went like that. So that's my one brush with a hurricane, mortal danger, and oak leaf almost knocked me out.
Well, speaking of wind speed, we actually have a wind speed question. Do you know if elevation has an impact on wind speed in a hurricane? So for instance, would somebody on a hill experience higher wind than someone lower down?
Yes. Well, the wind speed as they measure it is basically 33 feet above ground. But the higher you go, the further away from the frictional impact of the earth, the drag is. So yes, as you go higher, the winds can often be much stronger. For example, the hurricane of 1938, when it came roaring ashore, it was traveling so fast, almost 55, 60 miles an hour, that normally hurricanes, when they encounter land, they weaken very, very rapidly because there's no more warm ocean water to take energy from. But because the hurricane of 1938 was traveling so fast that by the time it reached Mount Washington, it actually knocked the cog railway off its tracks and caused a lot of damage at the observatory at the top of Mount Washington. So yes, the higher you go, sometimes winds can be much faster than at ground level.
Interesting. And
that's why I wouldn't want to be, I don't know if anybody's been following the news, but you know, New York City, where I was born in Queens, New York City has, they've recently have an area called Billionaires Row, where a lot of very rich people have bought $70 million, $80 million apartments in these enormous apartment buildings that look like pencils. They're right on the edge of Central Park. They're very narrow because they didn't have a lot of land to build on, but they go up almost a quarter of a mile. Unfortunately, these people have spent tens of millions of dollars are complaining now because the building design apparently wasn't up to snuff. And as a result, during windy times or even not very windy times, the buildings shake back and forth and groan. I can't imagine being in one of those buildings if another Hurricane Sandy hits. Because as you might remember during Hurricane Sandy, they were building some tall buildings and a couple of cranes crumpled and there was a danger of them falling to the ground. But when you have a huge building that's very thin and is that high and it's getting hit by 100-mile-an-hour winds, I'd be very nervous if I lived there.
We do have another scientific point of clarification. Could you just repeat again, to what depth does a hurricane affect the ocean?
Oh, it can hurricane affect the ocean? It can churn up water going down 100, 200 feet easily. But the thing that I had mentioned is that in order to get a hurricane jump started and give it the energy that it needs, basically you need to have temperatures in the water column of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit down to about 150 feet. One of the things that a hurricane does that is a little self-limiting as it moves along, because it is whipping up such tremendous waves, waves are not just a surface phenomenon. They churn up a lot of water. So hurricanes tend to churn up water from deeper layers, bringing up colder water to the surface, which helps to sap the hurricane of some of its strength. But the reason it doesn't kill it is because hurricanes are moving so fast in a forward direction that by the time the water gets churned up, welled up, the hurricane's already basically beyond that point, unless it's a very slow moving hurricane, which is not typical over the Atlantic. It's more typical once it gets very close to the coast. But the actual depth, I couldn't tell you if it's down to 200-300 feet. I wouldn't imagine it's more than 100 foot, 200 feet, that it's really having a big impact. And animals know that hurricanes are coming. Animals act in different ways. They've had eons to adapt to hurricanes. And a lot of fish, when the temperature, when the pressure goes down, fish can sense that in their otoliths or in other ways in marine animals, and they'll go to deeper water or they'll swim sort of out of the way. Birds will often try to get out of the way of a low pressure system, but unfortunately a lot of them can't move fast enough and they're swept up into the hurricane. And that's why we sometimes have sightings of tropical birds in the woods of Vermont and New Hampshire after a hurricane, because birds that got caught in the eye kept flying along with the eye. And by the time they made it to New England, they were pooped or they were, pushed out of the storm by downward drafts. So that's a fascinating thing. A lot of bird watchers after a hurricane, just like seashell. I used to be a real serious shell collector, and people down in Florida love when hurricanes come. If they're shell collectors, they don't like the damage. But after a major storm or a hurricane, you go down to Sanibel Island or you go to the west coast, the east coast of Florida, you'll find a lot of deep water shells that have been thrown up on the beach. And sometimes some old pirate treasure has been thrown up on the beach as well. So people often after a hurricane will go out to the beaches to see what nature has provided.
Very, very cool. Folks, I am going to go ahead and turn off the recording, and just in case somebody wants to ask a final question in person or make a comment. So just one moment. And thank you very much, Eric, for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me and coming. And still, believe it or not, I'm getting a lot of these Zoom talks, and I'm still getting used to it. It's just, I hope we're all in a more normal world in not too distant future and can see each other again.